The budget bill actually decreases federal regulation over waterways throughout Canada, like by 90%, and also makes it easier to take reserve lands from Indigenous people.
Aboriginal, that is a component of it, but I think what's interesting is that you're beginning to see ordinary Canadians who perhaps in the past didn't identify with the plight of Canadian Aboriginals beginning to identify with Aboriginal people because...
Hey there, welcome to Radio Free Canada. It is Friday, January the 18th, 2013. I'm Darren Howard.
And I'm Robert Nisbet.
We are catching up to Idle No More and this nonsense that's going on major media right now. They're not describing the case of poverty that's occurring across Canada. They're not talking about 1 in 4 children going hungry. They're not talking about 300,000 Canadian homeless, and we're here to ask why.
Well, they're here to talk about, the hockey strike.
Yeah, they're here to talk about Justin Bieber, and by the way, they've spent more time talking about royalty than they have talking about poverty. We're here to fix that. This is Radio Free Canada with an Idle No More update. We've got on the show, we're going to be talking about the initial impressions that the CBC and CTV were giving to the general public. And we're also going to talk about some polls.
Oh, yeah, the ones that says that people aren't supporting Idle No More.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. A bunch of rich white people describing to each other how they don't support poor people. I get it. You made your point. You've made your bed. Now you get to lay in it. What do we got coming up, brother?
We're also going to be talking about the Enbridge hearings and how the public's being shut out and the incidents that are rising because of that. And we're also going to turn our attention to Asia. And we also have some green technologies to talk about today as well.
That's all coming up. Radio Free Canada. Let's do a clip right now. Let's get right into it.
It is a movement of Native peoples in the Americas against legislation they say violate treaty rights of the Indigenous community in Canada, known as the First Nations.
The budget bill actually decreases federal regulation over waterways throughout Canada, like by 90%, and also makes it easier to take reserve lands from Indigenous people. And so it's basically looks like a 21st century land grab. And so it's totally restructuring treaty rights with First Nations in Canada right now.
According to opponents of several Canadian bills, particularly Budget Bill C-45, environmental protections are weakened, making it easier for energy companies to pollute its lands and waters.
Some people still live traditionally, and that's where we hunt. We need the water.
Queen was supposed to give authorization or get authorization to use that land, but the land is basically being taken from the people and used to process for coal and oil. And tar sands is a good example of how land can be swapped and taken from people.
The Idle No More movement began last November when Bill C-45 was first introduced in the Canadian government. In December, the bill was passed into law, boosting the movement's growth into the United States and around the world. Protests in solidarity with Indigenous Canadians have taken place in at least 10 states across the country and here in Washington, D.C. In the nation's capital, activists have been gathering outside the Canadian embassy to protest the bill's provisions.
Indigenous people have the prime right to their land. They should have the right to decide what that land is going to be used for. And so we're here standing in solidarity with the Indigenous people of Canada and the rights of people everywhere.
I'd like to support and show our solidarity with the chief and all our Native brothers in Canada.
Currently, dialogue is taking place between the Canadian government and Indigenous leaders to address the concerns of the First Nations. Activists say the Idle No More movement will continue protesting until their issues are resolved. Marjan Ossie, Press TV, Washington.
And that's the way that you start things off. The point being made there
that some people in the States are actually aware of what's going on up here in Canada, and they're standing in solidarity behind them.
Okay, so hundreds of people or hundreds of groups have formed across the United States in every major city in the state. CBC, CTV not carrying that side of the story.
No, they're not. They're just talking about how it's affecting our traffic and our economy here in Canada.
Yeah, I know. They're so worried about traffic. You know, what causes poverty? Well, bank policy, government policy causes poverty. They're not covering that story. But let's cover another story right here. Joshua Blakeney, Press TV, your update.
One of my favorite reporters.
The people have rallied in Canada to show their solidarity with the native rights movement, Idle No More. Protesters packed a shopping mall in Edmonton, in the capital of Alberta province. Organizers said more than 2,500 people had gathered there. The Indigenous communities, also known as the First Nations, have been protesting against their poor living conditions and high unemployment rate. A few days ago, First Nations chiefs met with Prime Minister Stephen Harper, but leaders said progress made in the meeting was not enough to stall the protest campaign. To discuss that a bit further, we're now joined by Joshua Blakeney, Press TV's correspondent, who is joining us now via Skype from Calgary. Now, Joshua, tell us what exactly Native leaders want to happen now. They've said that whatever occurred in the meeting was not enough to stop their protest movement.
Well, indeed, I think it isn't completely accurate to characterize the Idle No More movement as being solely Aboriginal. That is a component of it. But I think what's interesting is that you're beginning to see ordinary Canadians who perhaps in the past didn't identify with the plight of Canadian Aboriginals beginning to identify with Aboriginal peoples, because now the ordinary Canadian middle-class people are seeing themselves as also being victims of oppression, namely via this highly controversial Bill C-45, which is an omnibus bill. Now, one of the, some would say, fascistic traits of the Harper government is that they're trying to force through and ram through Parliament radical changes to almost every aspect of Canadian society, and that's what's happening with this omnibus bill. An omnibus bill addresses a diverse and unrelated array of laws and topics in Canada, only one of which is Aboriginal rights, which is why obviously the Aboriginal community have mobilized in recent weeks and months. So I think just as the Aboriginal people in recent years and decades have not been consulted fully by the Crown and by the Canadian government, now Canadian people are also not being consulted with, and that's why you see thousands and thousands of people amassing throughout Canada ubiquitously in order to protest the Harper regime, which of course we know now was proven to have engaged in election fraud in order to seize a majority of seats in the Canadian Parliament. And so it's not inaccurate to say that we've kind of gone through regime change in Canada, perhaps comparable to that of Chile, or what, you know, often we've seen in the past when countries are too democratic in the Americas, that there's been a kind of regime change implemented. And so I think that's what's happening, is that the Aboriginal community too are not just standing up per se for Aboriginal rights. I mean, obviously they want to defend the historic rights that they've won, but they're also just trying to defend Canadian sovereignty and Canadian democracy, what's left of it, from this
Joshua, I do apologize for having to cut you off, but it seems that we have run out of time. We'll have to leave it there for now, but of course we do appreciate your insight. That was Joshua Blakeney, Press TV's correspondent, speaking to us live via Skype from Calgary.
And there you go, once again, Joshua Blakeney exhibiting journalism.
Actually, he kind of nails it right there when he talks about how they're protesting Harper's fascist techniques.
Yeah, and he shuts out the news. He doesn't talk to the news reporters or get unscripted questions, especially about Idle No More.
Yeah, I know. It seems kind of totalitarian to me.
Yes, and, you know, the history books are being written by people like us, not by them, and that's kind of the important point, too.
Well, also the fact is our Native people aren't stupid here, and they do realize that Harper got in illegitimately through the election fraud.
The one thing that we hope people are not stupid about is the way that major media paints a racist picture. Right now, there's a poll going around saying that 60% support and that that's slipping, but this is from a white news source. You got a story?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, you make up your own mind.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with new signs. Public opinion about First Nations issues in this country is hardening. The Idle No More movement has successfully forced First Nations to the top of the national agenda, but an exclusive poll for Global News shows the majority of Canadians think the problems Native people face are brought on by themselves. Most Canadians support resolving land claim issues and making First Nations self-sufficient, but as Jacques Bourbeau reports, they want more financial accountability from Native leaders.
Her protest continues, but Chief Teresa Spence is not making much effort to promote her cause.
Chief Spence, how much support do you think you still have amongst Canadian people?
Spence believes many Canadians are on her side, but a new Global News Ipsos poll tells a different story. Only 29% of Canadians give her a positive approval rating. The poll also shows the Idle No More protests face a similar problem. The movement argues the Canadian government is not doing enough to help Canada's Aboriginals. But Canadians don't agree. The poll shows 62% think Aboriginals are treated well by the Canadian government, and 60% believe most of the problems of Native peoples are brought on by themselves.
Canadians are moving beyond the issue of guilt and responsibility and moving down to the issue of practical resolution. And they're frustrated by the fact that no matter how much money seems to be spent on these issues, that things just don't seem to be getting any better.
The poll shows despite their best efforts, First Nations leaders are having trouble making their case to Canadians.
With all the coverage it's been having on the media over the past several weeks, and it's kind of discouraging when you see people, that the majority of people still don't know what's going on.
According to the poll, Canadians also have real concerns about financial accountability. This website lists 167 reserves that are under some kind of management plan. And last week, an audit raised tough questions about how Attawapiskat handles its finances. The result, according to the poll, is only 27% of Canadians believe First Nations leaders are managing well the money given to them by Ottawa.
They don't understand First Nations people. They think that we're just, money grabbers. We are not money grabbers. We just get limited funding from the government.
A group that's been fighting hard for more financial accountability says Aboriginal leaders should be worried about these numbers.
A lot of people off reserve are fed up. They're just sick and tired of hearing stories from reserves where they're hearing about vote buying or excessive salaries, inefficiencies, that type of thing.
Canadians also believe the federal government has some responsibility. The poll shows 81% of Canadians don't want any additional taxpayers' money going to reserves unless external auditors are put into place. Donna?
Jacques, this shows a deep disconnect between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. You spoke to some leaders today. What did they make of this poll?
Well, they believe that Canadians don't understand the Native reality, that we don't understand the effects of colonialism, forcing people to live on remote reserves. We don't understand the corrosive legacy of residential schools. They also point out as well that Aboriginal affairs controls virtually all aspects of their lives. So frankly, they find it a bit rich that they're now being told that they're responsible for their problems.
All right, Jacques Bourbeau in Ottawa. Thanks, Jacques.
And, of course, Global being owned by one of the 6 major owners of major media in North America.
Well, of course, and they're going to give that kind of an opinion.
Yeah,
29%, that's an interesting number. Isn't that the same amount of people that actually voted Harper into office?
Yes. 29% support Idle No More, 29% support Harper.
That's kind of a weird disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah,
kind of an odd coincidence, just a little.
I'm kind of giving my head a shake here, because why?
But one thing I'm seeing is the media isn't presenting, or the mainstream media isn't presenting a balanced opinion of what's going on with this movement.
And they're not talking about where they get their poll information. Where do they get a poll? Now, how do you get on these polls? You have to have 2 credit cards, a kid in college, own 2 homes, and own 2 vehicles.
Oh, so they kind of pick their audience that they're polling.
Yeah. So just remember, Ipsos read polls are not a poll of regular people.
So it should say rich white people's polls.
Far be it from me to point it out. We've got more on the update. There was action on Wednesday, but that's the background that you need right now to make a decision. I'm Darren Howard.
And I'm Robert Nisbet.
We're coming right back with more from Idle No More, and we are asking the question. Please get informed and join Idle No More. We'll be right back. Radio Free Canada.
Quietly led them out of the room one by one, where they were put into a waiting wagon downstairs. So this was set up in a venue that was supposed to prevent these kinds of protests. There is another hotel about a kilometer away, and also in downtown Vancouver, where where the public is allowed to go watch these hearings. These hearings were just for the people speaking and their guest, no one else. So this was a breach of the security plan that the National Energy Board and the organizers had set up in anticipation prevention of these kind of protests, because both in Victoria and in Vancouver, this procedure was in place because of the threat of protests against this pipeline project.
So how are they going to prevent this happening in the future?
Well, the organizers say that they're going to still keep up this system. They're going to have 2 separate venues. After the protest today, there were 2 officers posted outside the room in which the hearings actually take place, and they say that they will have a distinct police presence right through the hearings, the remainder of this week, and then the hearings are back in Vancouver at a later date, and they'll also have the police presence there at that time too. Gloria?